I'd like to speak a little bit about the form, the solo form of Taijiquan, what it is and what it isn't. The first thing you should know about it is that despite its resemblance to forms and sets that are done in other martial arts, in Taijiquan it has a completely different function. Uh, Taijiquan, in fact, is a completely different way of teaching. Uh, it's not that the final result is so different. A lot of people think that Taijiquan is a conventional way of teaching in the sense that you learn it by doing this form, but it produces an unconventional result, some sort of mysterious powers or chi or something like this, so that you don't have to really do what most boxers do, most fighters do. This is wrong. It is a unconventional way of approaching something that's much more conventional than most people think, in the sense that the great lessons that you learn in Taijiquan, the skills that you have when you've learned it and mastered it, these are recognizable by all boxers, and they're not that different from what great boxers do. But I would like to think that because of its unconventional method of teaching, it has a greater possibility of producing sophistication than most forms of martial art. Now, most forms of martial art, they're called hard as opposed to soft. But think of them this way. In their solo forms, you are rehearsing exactly what you actually do when you fight. You are taking positions, you're making movements, and you're doing things that are exactly what you do when you fight. And in fact, with most martial arts, your test of how good you are is when you actually fight, do you do exactly what you have been training to do? In other words, if you have certain positions that you take and certain movements that you make, does the presence of the opponent cause those to become distorted in some way? Because with most martial arts, the positions that you're taking and the movements that you're making are designed to be very strong because of their structure and the way that force is delivered with them. So that if they're interrupted or in some way twisted or altered, you lose all this power. Taijiquan is, in this sense, they are hard in the sense that, like I say, if you are photographed doing fighting, then you should look kind of like you're doing the same thing that you do when you're rehearsing, when you're doing your martial or your rehearsal solo form. Now, Taiji is designed to adapt your position to the movements of the opponent and to his attacks. Now, in many senses, and in terms of many martial arts, this produces forms and positions that would be thought of as being weak. The reason they are not weak is because in Taijiquan we're cultivating a very different kind of force, and we're using a very different kind of method to produce root. Because of this, we seem to be able in fighting to break such rules. But actually, you should realize that Taiji is designed for its rules to be broken in a certain sense. Now, the solo form of Taijiquan was created as a modification of, shall we say, hard styles. In other words, it is reminiscent of and duplicates, in many cases, forms that are done in a very strong and powerful way. The mistake would be to think that what you are practicing is a different version of those forms, but intended to have the same kind of concept, that these are powerful positions which you then sort of impose upon your opponent. No, that's not true. And the question you should ask logically, well, if it isn't true, if that's not what you're practicing, if you're not practicing what you're eventually going to do exactly, what are you practicing? In Taijiquan, we really depend upon the cultivation of some rather esoteric habits. And when you do the solo form, you should regard it as your opportunity to develop those habits. I sort of expressed this in a book called Meditations, in which I said that the meditations you should be doing when you're doing Taiji involve many, many different specific things which you put your concentration on. The implication being you can't concentrate on all of them at the same time. You just can't do it. You don't even pretend to do it even when you've mastered them all. Mastering them all does not mean that you're thinking about them all at the same time. Mastering them all means you have done them enough so that they become embedded in the subconscious, so they become automatic things. And this is the opportunity that you have when you do the form. And this is why there is no correct form. There's many different versions with different numbers of movements and so forth. And some of them leave out movements. And you can, reasonably ask, well, gee, does this make this form inferior because it leaves out these movements? No. In a sense, every Taiji form, every Taiji solo form leaves out a lot of movements. Because what we're practicing when we really practice is the ability to make a bunch of variations of movements that you've seen. So there's no way it could encompass all of these movements. In fact, Jim and Ching said that actually practically 99% of everything you need to know from Taijiquan is in grasp the sparrow's tail, is in the first few movements. Because though those movements afford you the possibility of the concentration on various things. And this is the way you should regard the form, simply as this opportunity. So it is not a performance. In fact, any concept of the art of Taijiquan being connected with your performance of these moves is misconstrued. And in a certain way, you don't, I'm fond of telling my students, please don't master the form. The form is not something to be mastered. The form is something which, even if you practice for 50 years, it's your opportunity to say, there are certain elements that I've determined I'm a little bit weak on. There are certain consciousness things that I have not, they don't show up correctly when I do my sparring or when I do my advanced exercises. And so I'll identify those, and I'll go back to the form, and I'll do the form again and concentrate on those. And also, because you put your mind on different things when you do the form, there is no guarantee that you are getting better at it in the sense of that someone from the outside would watch and say, oh, that's better than you did last time. In other words, and like I say, it's completely folly to think of you impressing anyone else with it anyway. And in fact, as a student, you should be very wary of the warning that simply the copying of the forms for their outward movements, even if you copy them perfectly, apparently, you're not actually learning anything by doing this. You're not getting any better simply by doing the form better in that sense. You're only making correct use of the form when you use it to improve certain specific elements. And because of this, at least I'll give you an example. There's certain meditations which, if I really concentrate on them or really work on that element, it actually might upset something like my balance. And so it would look like I'm not as balanced. There's a certain, for instance, way of moving. Just to be technical, when you move your body from one leg to the other, there's several different ways of doing that. There's actually only a couple that people normally employ, however. One is the external use of muscles, or I should say the use of external muscles to sort of push yourself from one side to the other. And the other is the use of gravity. Now, almost everyone who teaches Tai Chi knows that this external use of muscles is a no-no. Of course, this implies there's another use of the muscles, which you must be learning. It's not enough to just not use your muscles in this way. But you'll also find that you're sort of using gravity to make your movements, sort of subtly sliding from one leg to the other, just releasing yourself and literally kind of, it doesn't look like it, but you're sort of leaning in one direction and you go off. This sound feels very good. It feels very smooth. It feels very soft. It feels very relaxed. And it moves, gravity tends to move everything at the same time. That's the function of gravity. So the problem is, when you are using this method, there is no real internal change going on in the body, because internal change implies that your movement progresses in a kind of serial fashion, that energy moves through the body and parts of your body change and other parts of the body, respond to that. As it says in the classics, it moves through the body like a breath. Your movement moves like a breath. It doesn't move you all at the same time. You don't suddenly everything moves as though you're sort of levitating or something like this. There was always this. Now, when you learn the correct way of movement, which is the utilization of Taijiquan to move, this will produce movement that doesn't seem smooth at all at first. It's your job to make it smooth. It's your job to smooth it out. But the point is, you can't just ignore it and use gravity. When you actually use Taijiquan, it produces a complex series of changes in the body. And this series of changes can be studied and improved and made conscious. And in a sort of irony, it's only correct when you've been conscious of it so often that it becomes unconscious, that it becomes just a habit of the way you move. So the process of doing the form is kind of realizing that there is no serial way to progress through all of these changes. There are certain things that are better studied in the form than other places. There are certain things that can only be studied in the form, and this is because the form is done extremely slowly. And this slow movement of the form, again, this would be the most absurd if you were trying to rehearse what you do when you're actually fighting. And this is the objection some people make to Taijiquan. Other boxers, they say, this is really silly. When you fight, you're going to have to move really fast. And so why not practice moving fast? This seems like a kind of obvious sort of observation. And yet in Taijiquan, the correct way to do the form is to do it very slowly. And that's the reason for this is when you are doing it very slowly, you can concentrate on certain technical things which you couldn't possibly correct at a high speed. And these have a lot of different names, differentiating substantial and insubstantial, lots of postural rules, using Taijiquan, but you can't do all these things at once. And so every time you do the form, you should feel like, okay, what is this? What am I concentrating on? Now, this is not to say that sometimes you may not just get up and just do the form in a sort of, automatic pilot sort of way. That's fine. But the point is, in that case, you're just kind of relying on your previous practice to have enough unconscious things happening so that you are doing things that are productive when you do the form. But in order to improve in it, what you have to do is identify, as one of my teachers used to say, your faults. You have to identify your faults and see if those faults can be corrected in the form. Now, when you are doing Taijiquan, there's lots of faults that you can't correct except in your behavior with another person. So you can't do everything with the form. In fact, you should not think of the form as definitive of what Taijiquan is. Taijiquan is defined by your behavior with another person. It's defined by your ability to make taijis with another person. And in a certain way, you can't really do that in the form because there's no other person there. Now, it's important that when you do the form, one of the things that you imagine is your imaginary opponent, because you want to feel like things you're doing are responsive. But this is something that you are imagining at this point, and you must really test this when some person is really actually there. Now, another thing is that the footwork in the form is not actually indicative of the actual footwork that you might actually use. The footwork that you use is completely responsive, completely based on the movements of the opponent. And yet, so in other words, when you learn a form in the solo form, you must understand that if you sort of identify, like, say, this is the place I should do this form, you don't know the footwork. The footwork you've practiced in the form is very minimal and has nothing to do with your actual response. So when demonstrating, for instance, the application of a movement in the form, it's quite reasonable for some observer to say, well, that doesn't look like you did the form. That doesn't look like the form. It looks like something else. And you have to explain to them how it actually relates to the form. And it relates to it in these habitual, internal sort of ways. And this is why you can't possibly learn the form simply by watching someone do it. In fact, in China, the teachers had sort of three classifications of students. There were like courtyard students, there were indoor students, and there were so-called bedroom students. Now, the courtyard students were simply allowed to sit, come to the courtyard and do the moves along with you. They would watch you, they could copy you, that's all they could do. The indoor students were students that you actually gave instruction to and told what to do. And the bedroom students were the students that you actually told the real important, most important secrets. In other words, it goes without saying that this makes it obvious that you cannot learn Taijiquan just by copying someone's movements, even if you do them perfectly. Somebody, as it says in the classics, you must be orally taught. Somebody has to tell you what you are doing. And in fact, it's a kind of real thing about Taijiquan that one of the hardest things about it is figuring out what you're actually learning to do. This has been said by people who have been very good at it and have done it for a long, long time. So, because the thing that you are learning to do is not made immediately obvious by simply doing the movements in the form. So, the form is useless without instruction. You give an instruction, then you know what you should be concentrating on and what you should be doing. So remember, don't perfect the form. Use it to perfect yourself.